Story 1. I was texting a guy every day for several months. We finally met up for our first date. It was the best date I've ever been on, and we were making plans for a second date. However, 2 days later, I received a call from his sister. He had died by suicide that morning, 6 hours after I last texted him. He left my name and number in the note, stating he didn't want me to think he had ghosted me. Story 2. Did not happen to me, but to a coworker. At the height of the dot-com boom, my coworker gave notice that he was taking a job with another company. At his new job, he would be the first worker in our city, so the plan was for him to work from home for a while. Before the notice period was up, our company, his current company, bought the company he was going to work for. For the first week or so, he was working at his new assignment from home. But since he now worked for the company he just left, and since they suddenly had a real office in the area, they asked him to come into his original office and take his original desk. Story 3. My family has gone to this one university pretty much since its founding. So, I never really entertained going anywhere else. So, I'm 19 years old, sitting in anthropology, and there's this old guy in there, like in his 70s. I'm a snoopy person, so I eventually arranged to sit next to him. I introduce myself. He introduces himself. Are you any relation to Bob, my last name? Now, keep in mind that although my family always attends the school, I'm 4 hours away from my hometown. But yes, Bob was my granddad. So, it turns out that he and my grandpa were not only dorm mates, they caught mumps together and were quarantined for a few weeks. He told some great stories. What he didn't know was that my grandpa was suffering from Alzheimer's. And during my next trip home, I was able to talk about his college years with the knowledge from my new friend. Story 4. My most recent partner and I had our second date interrupted by no fewer than 3 deaths in the family. 2 in hers, 1 in mine. We rescheduled for a 4th time and had a great time in the end, but it felt really strange. Story 5. In the span of 3 hours, my phone died. It got wet and stopped working. My car died, hooray for corroded battery terminals. My marriage died. My wife said she wanted a divorce and was going to move in with my coworker, who, as it turns out, was about to be promoted and would become my supervisor. My Xbox died, the red ring of death. After that last one, I thought, okay God, now you're just being petty. Story 6. Way back in the day when I was a young lad, I was making a solo 9-hour bus trip through Chile. I had woken up later than I should and could feel the weight of the hangover and could still taste all the liquor and junk food I had eaten the night before. I just wanted to get to my seat and sleep the entire way. I checked my ticket and it looked like my seat number was 24B. I had booked a seat near the end of the bus because I preemptively thought of the pending hangover when I had booked the bus trip a few days earlier and wanted to be far out of the way of anyone else. The entire bus was full as I walked by, and as I got to my seat, I see a lady, maybe 65 or so, sitting in my seat. I shrugged but saw that the seat right behind her, 25B, was open, so said forget it and went to sit on that one. The problem with the new seat was that I was at the very back of the bus against the back bus wall and the seat didn't recline at all. I half-heartedly tried to ask the lady who was in my seat that she had messed up and taken my seat. But the language barrier was big, and I was too hungover to make too much of an attempt. I said forget it and sank into my unfortunate non-reclining seat. It was a rough first couple of hours, made worse when the seat-stealing lady reclined my seat all the way back and gave me even less room to work with. And then a great moment happened. The lady got up from the seat and went to the bathroom. It was at this moment that I finally worked up enough energy, got up, and took my rightful seat. I figured that if the lady came back and made a fuss, I would show my ticket to the bus driver, and he would translate the situation that had occurred. When the lady came back, she looked at me with a kind of sad grin, stood for a second or so, then went to the back and took the seat I had previously been in. I had won the battle and didn't even need to talk to anyone to solve the situation. I slept the rest of the trip and had a smile as I walked off the bus. I figured I would throw away all my garbage as I left the bus station. I threw away my empty chips bag, my water bottle, and my ticket, which I caught a glimpse of one last time and saw I was assigned seat 25B. The entire time, I had been assigned the seat that didn't recline and had stolen the lady's rightful seat midway through the trip. I honestly couldn't believe it and stood there for probably 5 minutes, reflecting on how I had stolen the seat, how I had reclined it even farther back than she had, how I had smiled and even waved at her as I left. I still think about her sometimes, even 15 years later. Story 7. The little town I grew up in had these two car dealerships on opposite sides of town. One Chevrolet and one Ford. They were bitter rivals, engaging in attack ads, derogatory comments by salesmen, and billboard wars, among other tactics. When the owner of the Chevrolet dealership died, it was revealed that he had also owned the Ford dealership through a shell company. No one saw that coming, including many of the higher-ups who worked at the dealerships. Story 8. I was talking to one of my teachers at school one time about random stuff, and we ended up in a conversation where I mentioned that my grandfather was a music teacher and played in a band doing jazz nightclub circuits in the 1950s and 1960s. She asked his name, and when I told her, she said, "Oh, he taught me music in middle school. We called him Pops." Then we both laughed. Maybe not the most outlandish coincidence, but it did make me realize how small the world can be. He died when I was very young, so it was cool to meet someone who knew him. Story 9. I rode the bus in the 7th and 8th grades with a shy, insecure, awkward but sweet and sincere girl named Lynn. She was troubled. Her father had shot himself in front of her when she was very young. Her mother worked a lot and left her to herself much of the day. She would follow me home from the bus stop and leave notes on my bedroom window. We flirted heavily, but we never went together. By 9th grade, she sat in front of me in science class and, to get my attention, would let it be known she was keeping a diary and eventually passed it to me to read. In it, she wrote that a man, 19 or 20, would come over when the mother was not there, and they would fool around. Before long, she was pregnant by this man and eventually dropped out of school to have the baby. They married. She was perhaps 14. The last time I saw her was at the funeral of a mutual friend after high school. We were both 20 years old then. We sat and talked about how things had gone. Her marriage had not lasted long. He'd abandoned her and the baby. She had no support, struggled to make ends meet, and moved in with guys who could provide a place for her and her baby. It was a sad story. I never saw her again, and years later, when the internet came along, every so often I would think of her and looked her up to see what had become of her. It turns out she had shot herself just a few weeks after we had talked at that funeral. She was buried in a grave in a small town in Georgia. In 2021, I came across a news story that a conservative politician in Wyoming was preparing to run against Lynn Cheney for her United States House seat. I recognized the name of the politician from the diary. It was the man who had impregnated then left my friend, Lynn. She was a sweet person. I wish it had turned out better for her. Story 10. So, I'm a year out of college and living at home when I finally start to try doing online dating. This is 2010 in a small town with a low population area, and there just aren't a lot of people online at the time. I was talking to this woman a town over for a while. There is a story in there I'm skipping past, and we finally had our first date set up after a couple of months of chatting. As I'm on my way out, I realize I need to let my parents know why I'm leaving the house. So I go over to the other room where they're watching taped Judge Judy episodes and say, "Hey, I'm going out on a date. I may be out for a few hours." This kicked off the normal parental interrogation process about where I was going and how long I would be out despite the fact I'm 23 years old with an adult job and can handle myself. Finally, my dad, who owns a local furniture store, asks for her name. "Oh no, there's no way you know her." I sealed my fate with that line because my dad has forever told me that he knows everybody. So I gave him details. She works for a company. She lives in the next town over. He looks right at me and says her last name. Around the same time we started talking online, my now wife went into my dad's store and bought a mattress. A mattress my brother delivered. To this day, we joke that my brother made it into her bedroom before I did. The funniest part of all this is that my dad quite literally had to keep himself from telling my wife that he had a son her age that would be perfect for her during the sale. My wife later stated that if he had said anything, she would not have talked to me at all. Married 10 years this month. Story 11. 2 years ago, both my maternal and paternal grandmothers were alive. One was in her early 80s and relatively healthy, The other was in her late 80s, and she had been having a series of health complications. She got COVID and then got pneumonia. It was bad, really bad, and we were preparing for the worst. Her lungs were in pretty bad shape, and she wasn't responding to medication. They even found some weird lumps in her lungs, which the doctor said could be caused by the pneumonia itself, but there was a chance it could be cancer. And then my healthy grandmother died from a stroke. As sad as it was, the story has a relatively good ending. My sick grandma made a full recovery and the spots in her lungs are gone. Life is funny that way. Story 12. A friend of mine is the owner and operator of a horse ranch and stable. Basically, rich people pay her to take care of their horses so they do not have to. She also breeds on this ranch, and these are some very expensive bloodlines, to the point that there are armed guards escorting the horse trailers sometimes. One night, she gets a call from her security chief. She has been expecting a call because one of the Maras is pregnant and due any day. The only oddity is that it is her security chief calling her instead of the trusted veteran ranch hand who she had assigned to watch the mare for signs of going into labor. It turns out the security chief called because, rather than calling it in, this ranch hand helped the mare through pregnancy, then loaded the foal into his flatbed and tried to steal it. Well, you cannot just drive off a secure property like that unnoticed at the gates. So he tried to flee across the pasture, presumably rammed through a corral fence or something. Security noticed this and intercepted his truck, which is when he started shooting. He and another hand who was in on this bizarre heist got in a shootout with the ranch's ex-military security guys. So my friend got a 4 a.m. phone call that basically was, "Ma'am, the foal has been born, but your head ranch hand tried to steal it with another employee. The foal is fine, but both ranch hands are dead, and police are on their way. We thought you would want to know." Mind you, the ranch opens to clients at 7 a.m., and a place swarming with cops and a 10-year veteran employee dead after attempted theft of a 6-figure animal was not a good look for the ranch's public relations. So she spent her early morning frantically attempting to do everything police needed done, while also avoiding having anyone outside of need-to-know people find out about this fiasco. By the way, this ranch hand was already pulling in 6 figures himself. He was her favorite employee, one of her most trusted managers of affairs. All he needed to do was tell her he would like a raise, and she would have gladly given it to him. But no, he decided he wanted the quick payday of trying to sell a stolen pedigree animal on the black market. It sounds like something out of an episode of Yellowstone or Walker, Texas Ranger. This story, when relayed to me, was the first time I found myself actually relieved that I had to get out of the world of horses due to injury. Story 13. When I was 16, my dad died. A week later, I decided to still attend an event I had to try out to get a seat in, ranking 9th out of 101 applicants. Mentioned because if circumstances had been different in multiple ways, I wouldn't have been there. I met a young man there, we exchanged details, and he asked me to his school prom. I ended up bowing out and kind of ghosting him. We didn't have the money at all, and he wasn't like anyone I'd ever met before. I didn't know what to make of him. 3 years later, I went to college and came across him again when he was visiting the campus. We reconnected, fell in love, and as of this past March, have been together for 25 years and married for 22 years. That's not the twist, though. The twist. My best friend while attending college was very close with his sister, and she'd had a huge crush on him for years. She said she used to hate the random girl he asked to the prom instead of her. This wasn't a small town. Our high schools were a full 45 minutes from each other, and I really only met 2 or 3 people from his high school ever. Story 14. From Florida, I went on my honeymoon on a Mediterranean cruise. We visited the Leaning Tower, where the tour guide asked me a few questions, catching the attention of another passenger. On the bus ride back to the airport, he and his wife struck up a conversation with my wife and me because he grew up in my city. My wife and he had attended the same school, which helped us keep the conversation going. Finally, he asked where I lived now, and I told him we had just bought a house in a neighborhood that is not well known. He mentioned he lived in that neighborhood as a child and asked, "What street?" I told him, and he revealed he also grew up on that street. "What house number?" he asked. But before I could answer, he disclosed my house number was the house he grew up in. My wife and I were both shocked for about 2 minutes before we had to go opposite ways from that couple to catch our separate flights. In summary, I met the guy who grew up in the house I had just bought halfway around the world.